as you heard, had quite a bit of experience with waterbirds in Australia, but currently I've been working on a PhD thesis on brolga movements and habitat use in southwestern Victoria. And my project is very, very much related to how research can actually feed into conservation of brolgas within that region. So, first of all, what is a waterbird? Most of you would probably be quite familiar with waterbirds. They basically need water at some part of their life cycle, so whether it be for breeding or feeding or just for protection like roosting at any stage of their life cycle. So these are just a few examples of waterbirds on this slide. So we've got cormorants, little pieds and little blacks. We've got musk ducks, got some spoonbills and pelicans. So you might be quite familiar with a lot of those. So as Matt has probably already outlined a little bit, there are a number of threats to waterbirds. And one of the major ones is a loss of habitat or modification to their wetland habitats. These are just some of the examples of how those wetlands might be lost as habitat to the birds. There's a lot of drainage that occurs to actually utilise these areas for farming purposes, either for cropping or grazing. And my examples mostly come from southwest Victoria for this. This is brolga habitat, and these are pictures that I've taken during aerial surveys for brolga nests out in southwest Victoria. There's also been a lot of conversion of wetlands to crops, and a number of them have been dammed to provide water points for stock. And there's another threat as well in terms of habitat loss in southwest Victoria, where there are a lot of blue gum plantations going in these areas where there are quite a lot of wetlands. And there's just another picture that shows in the wider landscape how after a little while, when you start losing this habitat one by one, you're actually losing a lot of habitat across the region and the landscape, and you'll end up losing connectivity, and therefore the birds will either move somewhere else or they may lose their breeding habitat, which means that that'll reduce their breeding and their numbers in general. So they reduce in size, in numbers, and become quite threatened. Other threats in terms of wetlands are water quality and salinity as well. So many wetland birds, waterbirds, actually really prefer fresh water compared to saline wetlands. Now, brolgas actually use both, and I've got study areas where they seem to be preferring to use the freshwater wetlands, especially when they do have water early in the season when they come back from their breeding areas to their non-breeding areas. But as those dry up over summer, they then go and roost at saline wetlands where they actually can't necessarily feed, so they'll be moving out to cropping areas to feed on grain, which is mostly what they feed on during their non-breeding season. So other threats to waterbirds is diversion of water from wetlands and alterations to flooding regimes. So Murray River is a great example of how we've really manipulated the flows and altered flooding regimes and flows to wetlands that are associated with the river. So you can see in this picture that Murray River has a lot of these floodplain areas. So when we put a dam across the river, we reduce the amount of flow or stop it altogether, and we lose these wetlands which may have been available for waterbirds in the past. And now there are this has been really well recognised, and there are environmental flow programs, which Anna will be speaking after me about the Gunbow flooding project. So there are measures to try and address this issue of reduced flows and loss of habitat, especially along the Murray River, and how it's affected these waterbirds that live around this area. Another threat that you're probably quite well aware of is predation, and especially from native predators like cats. Now, that is not a waterbird, but I'm sure you get the picture. So they're really destructive in terms of actually eating the adult birds, the young birds, as well as the eggs. So they can really affect the survival of birds at any part of their life cycle and can really knock down populations. And the other one is the fox. Now, most encounters with foxes and waterbirds would not appear as friendly as in this cartoon. It'd be more like this. Now, this is courtesy of a photographer in Portland whose name I've unfortunately forgotten, but he's gotten some amazing photos of this brolga defending a tiny 2-week-old chick, little fluffy thing, in this wetland. And there's a series of photos that he's provided where this fox comes into this wetland, and one of the pair of the brolgas is really having a good old go at the fox. But the parents may not be successful in scaring foxes off all the time. I've heard lots of anecdotal observations about how foxes can be quite cunning as well with breeding brolgas, and they've seen foxes actually separate the parents from the chick and eventually actually going for the chick. But we don't actually know with brolgas specifically how big a threat the foxes are compared to other potential threats in terms of this breeding. So there are other threats as well, including disturbance and more recently as well climate change. But climate change is most likely to really impact mostly on this area of losing habitat or modifying existing habitat. So we've got a number of threatened waterbirds in Victoria, and I know that there's some of you from New South Wales as well here. A lot of these are common to both states in terms of their threatened status. So Matt's already mentioned the Australian painted snipe, which actually migrates between Australia and the Northern Hemisphere. And during its non-breeding season, it spends here, and obviously it's spending quite a lot of individuals spending their time in those rice fields, which is really interesting to hear. So this is actually critically endangered. So it's a really, really threatened bird, which means that we don't have very many of them in the world. And there's usually a lot of public concern to try and protect these really threatened species. There's another bird that we've already heard a bit about, which is the Australasian bittern. So that's endangered. Freckled duck, endangered. Little egret, endangered. And the list goes on. So as you can see, there are lots of threatened waterbirds in Victoria, in Australia in general. And that's mainly been due to reduction in population numbers due to those threats that I just outlined before. So how do we actually protect waterbirds? Well, we've got these international, Australian federal and then local obligations, as well as treaties and the treaties of understanding between countries as well. So the first one on the list here is in terms of the international protection, we've got what are called the Japanese an Australian Migratory Bird Agreement, China, Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, and one also for the Republic of Korea and Australia. And this basically means that the governments of these nations have gotten together and recognised that we have these migratory birds that spend part of their life in Australia and part of it in Japan or China or in South Korea along the Yellow Sea. Yellow Sea is a really important area. And that we should really have some kind of a memorandum of understanding to protect the habitats that they use, and also try and ensure that we're not losing the populations of these birds. And there's the Ramsar, which is International Convention on Important Wetlands, and then there's the International Union of Conservation of Nature Red List, which lists a whole lot of threatened animals and plants across the globe. So a lot of these international agreements and threatened species lists are then considered and built into our legislation in Australia under the EPBC Act. And I'm really sorry about all these acronyms. I don't need to understand or remember them, but I'm just pointing out that there are these bits of legislation that we use to protect our waterbirds and also to assess any potential impacts on them. So there's the EPBC Act, which incorporates all of these international agreements. And then locally in Victoria, we've got the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, and under that legislation, the Department of Environment Primary Industries produces these action statements for threatened animals and plants, as well as communities. And there'd be a similar kind of legislation operating in New South Wales. I can't remember what the act is called, but they would also have ways to protect and also assess impacts under their legislation. Now, one of the things that's not on this list, which is something that Matt has highlighted in his talk, is one of the really important things about wetland protection, pardon me, especially in Victoria and New South Wales, where a lot of, or at least in Victoria, I know that a lot of wetland habitat is actually on private land. So, for example, the Victorian Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act doesn't really, it can't really be enacted on private land. It's for protection on public land, really. Although for species listed under the Federal Act, that can be used even on private land. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's really important to have private landholders on board with any wetland conservation and waterbird conservation. So, for example, in Victoria, about 90 to 95% of the brolga's habitat is on private land. So unless we can get landholders on board to get engaged in the important wetland conservation and management, we probably don't have much hope in terms of trying to manage that particular species. So why would we want to monitor water birds and conduct research? Why not just go out there and enjoy the birds on the wetland and do a bit of bird watching and take all your friends along with you? Well, often we've got these conflicts between the land use or particular developments and wetland habitat. So as the human population is growing, increasingly our demand on land is even higher, so that means that a lot of natural habitat ends up being converted to our users, mainly for housing, for example, in urban areas. In rural areas, it'd be conversion to food production. And so often we actually want to know what is the level of potential impact on these water birds and changes to the water bird habitats and numbers, and is there something that we can do to actually have two of them, both the land use and development and habitat protection, work together to try and protect these habitats and the waterbirds. So this is just a graph that shows some surveys that Kingsford and Old did on a number of breeding pairs of colonial waterbirds and Macquarie marshes. So you can, by monitoring waterbirds, and in this case the colonial waterbird breeding pairs, you can really look at the changes across the years. And then if you've got some information about, say, rainfall or flooding regimes, you might be able to then try and start to work out, okay, how come we're getting lots and lots of pairs in this year and these years, but not so many in these years? What's going on there? Is it natural variation? Is it something that we're doing? And those are the kind of things that we'd need to, the bits of information that we'd need to have to work out, well, okay, what are the changes and the impacts on these waterbirds? And the other thing we might want to do is actually identify any important areas for habitat protection. So for example, this picture is from a work that one of my colleagues, Birgitta Hansen, was involved in when she was working at Arthur Rylah Institute, and they were doing an assessment of shorebird habitat in Western Port Bay as part of potential port development and expansion in that area. So she went around in a boat, counting shorebirds and identifying where the birds were feeding. So these are the intertidal flats where shorebirds feed in. And then she also identified where the birds were roosting at high tide. So when the high tide actually covers these feeding areas, what are the important roosting areas? And then what you can do is you can overlay these kinds of important habitat areas with what your development might be impacting on, and then trying to work out, well, how is that going to actually impact the habitats? Is it going to remove some of it? And are we potentially going to lose part of the population from feeding, or exclude them from feeding in a particular area, and potentially forcing them to feed in areas that may be suboptimal and where they may not be able to fuel up for these really long migratory journeys that they have to make halfway across the globe. We might also monitor to actually look at how well we're doing when we are trying to restore habitat or manage habitat. So Matt was giving some really interesting and good examples about with the Australasian bittern and its responses to the habitat changes and in the New South Wales rice fields. So similarly, with environmental flows, which are designed to attract, well, first of all, improve the habitat for waterbirds, especially for these colonially breeding birds, so that they come back and actually breed successfully in these areas. So we might want to know, okay, well, when we actually do put water back into the system, are the birds coming back to breed? How many of them are breeding? Are we successful in our management and restoration efforts? And if not, why not? And how can we potentially change what we're doing? And finally, monitoring and data often gets used in making environmental decisions. So do we put water down, environmental water down the Murray to try and flood these areas? And then we also use research and monitoring data for policy development. So for example, the EPBC Act now has some guidelines for monitoring impacts on a lot of threatened species. So there are a number of different ways we can monitor or research particular species. For example, citizen science data is becoming increasingly important and valuable in management and making conservation decisions as well, so protecting certain areas So that basically means that we've got members of the public going out, collecting data on birds and then logging those records onto what's called the Australian Bird Atlas. So that can be done through BirdLife Australia. And then one of the other ways of monitoring is by counting birds. So we can look at different size at different times of the year. What are the population numbers doing? Are there fluctuations? And this has been really important, especially in the migratory shorebird research, where they've identified that some major habitat losses in China have actually resulted in reduction in numbers that are now overwintering in Australia as well. And so, but because they had this really long-term data set where they'd been collecting data up in northwestern Australia, doing really regular counts, and they were also doing counts along the East Asian, Australasian flyway, they were able to link loss of habitat in the Yellow Sea with the loss of numbers. So what happened in the mid to late 2000s, in South Korea there was a massive intertidal habitat reclamation project where they built a huge seawall and reclaimed 40,000 hectares of habitat, and there were actually direct losses on the mudflats, because as soon as the tidal influence stopped with the seawall, the birds had no food and they were actually dying on the mudflats. So that kind of shows the importance of counting methods, especially when you're looking at this really kind of important flyway, and it's important to know at each site what's going on. A more direct way of research is marking and tracking. So I guess in this list we sort of go from bigger detail down to smaller detail, and all these methods are used for different purposes. So it really depends on what we actually want to know about the particular birds or populations. So there's a lot of marking that goes on in the shorebird research world, and that has actually enabled us to find out where the birds are going. So in the past they just put plain colour flags on the birds, but now they're putting these engraved flags. So this one's got this bird here, it's got an engraved flag with LP on it. So when someone sees it in Taiwan or in China, they can go, okay, we know that bird came from Victoria. And we know exactly where in Victoria because you can identify it from that letter combination on the colour flag. And colour flagging and colour marking gets used a lot, especially in looking at where birds might be moving in the landscape and what particular habitats might be more important compared to others. And it also gets used in looking at how well the birds are surviving. So if you see a bird that's been marked over a number of years, you can start getting an idea of what the survival of that particular species might be. And then there's tracking. So tracking takes this movement research even further. Often, a lot of these places that the birds go, we don't know. And as Matt mentioned, with the Australasian bittern, we don't know where they go from New South Wales after their breeding season. Is that right? Yeah. So tracking can reveal where birds are actually going in much more detail, but it's also very expensive. So a lot of people don't do it because of that. So I was really fortunate to have quite a bit of funding for my project, and I ended up putting 23 trackers on brolgas in southwest Victoria. So a tracker like this, so it's got solar panels, you can just see there. It's attached with a leg band, so it's got a colour leg band as well, so you can identify it from that after the battery life runs out. So that, can anyone guess at the cost of a transmitter like that? It's about that size. $4,500. But they're not cheap. Yeah. So you want to make sure that if you're going to be spending that much money, that you've got a really focused question and that data will be well used for conserving that species. So you don't want to be just doing it for fun. So yes, they are not cheap. So a bit more about citizen science. So BirdLife Australia has got this system, very standardised system of doing surveys, where you can do 20 hectare or 20-minute survey. But they also use just incidental records, which is just, if someone goes out there and we see a brolga on the paddock, and then we can just log that. So they compile all this data into these atlases. So there's the Atlas of Australian Birds, old version and the new version, and that's in book form, but it's also electronically. So you can get these data from BirdLife Australia if you're interested in doing some further analysis. And they form these maps, or the product of these records are these distribution maps across Australia. So we can get a pretty good feel for where the birds are or where the birds have been seen. And there's now a new project which by my understanding is modelled on an American equivalent of this electronic bird record submission process, where anyone can log online and put in their bird records. So each record contributes more to our knowledge of where the birds might be, which can then be used to actually predict what might happen to the birds in the future. So none of these are wetland birds. I couldn't find an equivalent map for wetland birds, unfortunately, but this is another colleague of mine who looked at the impact of climate change on a whole suite of birds up in that mainly inhabit the tropical savanna region. So she had a couple of hundred different species, and she used those occurrence records from BirdLife Australia, so these ones from the Atlas, overlaid them with a whole lot of different climate and weather variables and future climate scenarios, and came up with these prediction maps where you can see the green is where, with future climate scenarios, that habitat or the distribution is likely to be unchanged. And then red is where it's lost, and blue is where you might get a bit more, or where the distribution might expand. So the point here is that kind of data that's been collected by citizens and members of the community and bird watchers and researchers in the past, once you put it all into one place, anyone can use it for really important predictions about how these birds might be affected in the future. And the other thing that's been increasingly done is, as well as producing these kinds of maps of predictions of what might happen in the future, they use a whole lot of different variables. So, for example, land use or urban expansion, things like that, to look at where you might want to prioritise areas for conservation and protection. So you might want to identify where are the areas where you should put money into to conserve. And this is obviously at a much, much bigger scale than I've been working on. But the governments and policymakers are increasingly wanting these sort of big scale predictions and ways to work out where they might want to conserve areas or manage, for example, wetland areas. And you can also build into this, doing surveys of landholders to find out who might be interested in protecting waterbird habitat, and then you can then take the ones out of your prioritisation mapping where you know that landholders or councils or whatever are not willing or don't want to for some other reasons or can't protect those habitats. So you can do fairly fine-scale conservation management decision making using this kind of citizen science data. So as I mentioned before, the counting is really important. These are pictures from Broome. So there's lots and lots of migratory shorebirds there sitting on a high tide roost, which is the best time to count because when they're all out on the mudflat, and the tide in Broome goes out over 10 kilometres sometimes, so you can't count them unless they're actually sitting on the beach nicely bunched up like that, which can also be a challenge when you've got lots of little grey bodies all sort of stuck together, big ones and small ones. But yeah, that's the best way to count them. And this other picture is of enthusiastic bunch of shorebird counters at 80 Mile Beach, which is about 300 kilometres south of Broome, and where they take these annual counts where they're monitoring the numbers and the species that are using those areas. Richard Kingsford has been doing a lot of aerial counting in Australia, and he's covering pretty much all of Australia every year. So he has got some really good data on where waterbirds are and what they're doing and how big the populations are and how they're changing over time. So this is just an example of him and his survey team. They do these transects across Australia, and where they just fly along these transects and count waterbirds along them, and they record them diligently, and then they can look at the changes over time. So you don't have to concentrate too much on here. I'll show you the main pattern. So these are basically graphs of waterbird numbers across the years for different parts of these areas that they're surveying. And what he's been able to do from this long-term study, a really well-designed study, is that he's shown that across Australia we've got this reduction in, if you don't look at that graph for now, reduction in waterbirds. And there is another graph here that shows the same pattern. So that's another way that you can really, with long-term counts, look at how your populations are changing and then work out, okay, well, why are they going down when they were up here in 1980s? And he's been able to conclude that a lot of these patterns are tied to those flooding regimes that I mentioned earlier that have been changed, especially around the sort of Murray-Darling Basin all across here. So it's been directly linked to the reduction in water in the whole landscape, and therefore you've got no water, you've got no wetlands, you have no birds, or you have less birds. So a bit more on the marking. So we've got some shorebirds here. These are migratory shorebirds. Now I apologise for not having any shorebirds that you might see around the traps, which are, you probably mainly see the sharp-tailed sandpipers, and if you're lucky you might see the Australian painted snipe. This is a great knot, which is actually one species that suffered greatly from that big reclamation project in Korea that I mentioned. So what the way to study group in Australia and way to study people elsewhere along that flyway in China and Taiwan, Japan do, they put these different colour flags on them. So, for example, we've got each bird from different area is identifiable by the colour and the combination of the flags that get put on it. So this bird I'm pretty sure I've got it right, it's from Zhongmingdao, which is in China. And this one is a Victorian bird. So what they've been able to tell from this are these migratory pathways. So this is just showing how many birds have been recorded of flag birds have been recorded at different locations along this flyway, and the bigger dots are the ones where there are more of these recorded. So this has shown that this is for the bar-tailed godwit, which hangs around mostly around beaches and shorelines and feeds on those intertidal mudflats. So we've got subspecies in New Zealand and Victoria, and you can tell that there's some movement between Victoria and New Zealand. So they've seen some of these green, these are actually Queensland flags, these green ones. But you can tell if I'm in Victoria and I see a flag bird from New Zealand, I know that it's come from there. And similarly, along the flyway, we've got people looking for them everywhere during migration, which is now. There's actually a Facebook page where people are recording their sightings as they're seeing. So you almost see this migration live if you're following it, which is great. And these flag sightings have really identified where the key habitat areas are for these birds. And one of the big ones is yellow sea, and it's important for a number of these migratory species. So that's been about 5 minutes. That's good, because I think I've got 3 more slides. So yes, I'll move on to the next one. Another case study is, so this is Reese Pedler's work on the banded stilt in central Australia around Lake Eyre and Lake Torrens. And this project was initiated because the mine there was seen as potentially affecting this species. So they wanted to have more information about whether they were actually going to use these pondage areas for toxic wastewater. It was actually radioactive from memory. So they really needed to know the detailed movement paths of those birds and where they're actually using the ponds. So he's been using satellite tracking devices on these birds to find out whether they're actually using those ponds, but he's also finding out a lot more about what has previously not been known about banded stilts in terms of their movements, and they're making big movements. He's also found movements across the entire country, so it's pretty fascinating stuff. And then finally, my own pet project, the Brolgas. So my project was initiated originally because there was a concern that increase in wind farm development in southwestern Victoria within Brolga's key non-breeding and breeding areas was potentially going to harm them in some way, either by increasing the deaths of the birds from potentially colliding with these turbines or additional power lines. And the other concern was that perhaps they would get disturbed by the turbines or the wind farm areas and would therefore be excluded from those good areas where they're breeding especially. So I've been putting trackers on them as well. Unfortunately you can't see this bird, but it's a chick. It's about 8-week-old chick, about that big, and it's got a transmitter like the one I showed you before and colour bands. And this is adult and juvenile that also got satellite transmitters. These guys have got them on the back. And I've been able to find out pretty detailed movement paths. So found this pattern where I've got birds moving in this southwestern direction, about 120 kilometres, and the birds seem to be using pretty much the same path. Now, I have also found that there's another group just doing this. But yeah, so in terms of actually managing and conserving the population, the department might want to recommend to wind farm companies not to put wind farms or wind farm infrastructure within that movement corridor. Also got pretty detailed information about their home range use, so how big an area are they using on a sort of monthly basis. So each one of these fixes is a GPS fix, so they're using these wetlands where they're roosting, and then they're feeding out in these paddocks on grain. So then what I'll be able to do is actually work out how big an area they're using, and then that area can be used as a buffer where we're not going to put turbines or power lines to make sure that we're not actually affecting their breeding, or we're not affecting them during their non-breeding season. So I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and thank you all for being interested in waterbirds and wetlands. I think it's fantastic to have such a good turnout. And Cass and Tess and everyone else at North Central CMA for inviting me, and Di.